And we're live. It is Thursday. What am I talking about? October 24th, 2024. Just about 10 days before the asteroid impact. It is 6:01 p.m. I told you that Dog Shirt TV begins on time and ends on time, but there is an exception to that rule. And that is the exception when I make the insane decision to use my half hour between live streams to run home from the Brookings Institution so that I'm in the hammock studio and get into a traffic jam and then get into the house just in time to start the live stream, and then have two anxious dogs and then we might be a minute late, and that is what happened today. We are not allowed to have fun anymore.
Oh, just you wait, Benjamin Wittes. Just you wait.
We are allowed to see whether Pete Strzok keeps his promises. He promised to be here in a dog shirt today.
Who promised? You would sooner get Felix Dzerzhinsky wearing a Romanov T-shirt than you would Pete Strzok in a dog shirt.
Well, I just want to say I represented.
That's a deep cut for your IR scholars and Russian historian listeners.
I represented to the audience that there would be Pete Strzok in a dog shirt today that he had promised. And so the question is, did I lie? Or is the lesson never trust the deep state?
I think we need to pipe in some little fair use, careless whisper song or something. But yeah, no, I've been very, very outspoken in the past about my opinions about dog shirts. I walk my dog in this shirt.
So there's some dog on the shirt.
There is some dog on the shirt. This is
all right. It counts. That's how we're resolving this situation. Pete Strzok, we're not allowed to have fun anymore.
Split the baby.
In about a week and a half, you are never
Solomon-like wisdom. We have
never going to have fun again.
Pete is
but we are allowed to have you on the show. What gives, man? How are you doing?
I am increasingly, it's funny. I'm realizing every time I think, I'm, better. I'm kind of moved on. That, no. Every time we approach an election, I'm back in the throes of the trauma of 2016 and 2020, and it's just not it's a time marked with apprehension. As much as I would like to be a happy warrior, I am kind of a warrior, but I don't know what adjective I would attach to that warrior.
So how are you waging
pessimistic war? I have done. Let's see. So what I'm not doing is being particularly active on social media, which has been generally positive for my mental health. But I did a series, participated in some tabletops that Bart Gelman and Rosa Brooks put on under the auspices of the Brennan
in one
Center.
Of those with you.
Yep. And I thought those were, kind of worthwhile thinking out as much as anybody can think out what a Trump administration would look like and how to strengthen guardrails. I did what was turned into a documentary called War Game, a series, a scenario that brought together a bipartisan group to talk about it was sponsored by an organization called Vet Voices, which is a nonprofit organization looking at veterans issues, among them radicalization in the military. And several of their members, retired generals, read an op-ed in the Washington Post over a year ago saying, hey, we need to worry about radicalization in the military. And if you look at the numbers of veterans amongst the January 6th charged, like it's I think I'm going to get these numbers probably a little bit wrong, but the numbers of veterans amongst the January 6th people who are charged are more than 3 times larger than the numbers of veterans in the U.S. population. So veterans are disproportionately represented in the January 6th insurrection amongst those charged. And so the broader question was, from these generals in this op-ed, does DOD have a radicalization problem? And are they looking at that sufficiently? And from that op-ed, this organization put together a tabletop exercise saying, okay, say we had, another January 6th with an outbreak of violence, but this time you had larger numbers of the military, essentially switching sides. And what would that look like? And how would that play out? So doing things like that to try and think through how we're best. And I was stunned and disappointed to see it looks like Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who is a noted scholar on authoritarianism and fascism and
former guest on Dogshirt TV.
And there you go, who apparently was all set to speak at the Naval Academy about fascism, and it looks like disinvited her because of concerns that she would say truthful things about Trump. And she, I guess, has said, no, I'm not, didn't plan to talk to about Trump at all, but nevertheless is not, as it stands now, going to be speaking at the Naval Academy. And never mind that West Point, the Army Service Academy, had Elon Musk 2 or 3 months ago speaking. So Elon Musk, who is actively giving out $1 million checks, although I guess he stopped today after his warning letter from DOJ, handing out $1 million checks for people to sign his stupid petition. He's fine for Service Academy. Ruth, not fine for Service Academy. And the term anticipatory obedience pops in the mind.
Comes to mind, yeah.
Yeah. And much like, it's interesting in your old stomping grounds, like not only did the LA Times refuse to endorse a candidate for president, there's some rumbling I saw either in Axios or somewhere that Washington Post may not either. They haven't yet. And there's some question about whether or not, with the new editorial leadership and Bezos being scared about losing contracts if Trump is elected, whether they decide to sit it out. Are you hearing rumblings that they might not endorse?
So I'm free to talk about this because I have had exactly 0 conversations on the subject. So first of all, when I left the paper, Don Graham still owned it, and or the Graham family. He still controlled it. There is no way that the Washington Post under Don would not have made an endorsement in this race. And similarly, long after that, there is no way that Fred Hyatt would have tolerated not making an endorsement. Fred died a few years ago. And so now you have an ownership and an editorial page management that is different there. But there is still a large number of the people who are on that editorial board who are people who I think it would be unthinkable for them not to. And so I think I would fully expect them to make an endorsement this Sunday, which would be consistent with their normal practice, which is to wait a relatively long time to do it. And I think if they were to sit this one out, the word insurrection comes to mind within the confines of that group, which is remains a very serious group of people. And so I don't want to make a prediction about what's going to happen, but I will say I know that group well enough that there are a bunch of them who will not sit still for not doing the right thing under these circumstances.
Yeah. Do you think that not sitting still would extend outside of the editorial side of the house to the newsroom side? I know
it shouldn't.
There's been some movement on the newsroom. I know some publicly known, some I don't know if it's been announced yet, but I don't know that it seems like it's a one-way flow out. I've seen people leaving the Post and not necessarily coming in, but
yes. So let's break up issues here. There are a bunch of people who have left the Post because of internal politics and some terrible management decisions at the Post. They've lost some star people, including most importantly for this audience, Shane Harris just left and went to the Atlantic. So there is anxiety about at the Post, and that has to, the reasons for that are very public. They're and they are both financial and also editorial reasons related to some decisions involving Sally Busby and some of the people from that guy from the Telegraph that was going to come in and so I think there's all of that stuff is real and has driven a certain exodus. That has nothing to do with this. This is the publisher, the editorial page reports to the publisher. It is separate from the news side, and there has been since Don sold the paper, and particularly since Fred died, because Fred was a major source of continuity between the Bezos era and the Graham era, and he really created a space in which that editorial page could remain quite independent. That the question of whether it remains, of what the current publisher wants to do with it is an open one, and there's been a lot of grumbling about the operating environment over the last couple of years, and some of that is the natural thing that happens when you have a transition. Fred had been in that office for 20 years, or almost, little more than 20 years, and Meg had been in it for 20 plus years before that. So this is an office that changes gradually, infrequently, and when it does, it's a major, major change. The day the Washington Post did not endorse the candidate running against Donald Trump, that will be an almost cosmic institutional failure, and I would expect major fallout if that were to happen. I don't believe it's going to happen. I can't. I find it very hard to imagine that the group of people that I know, some of whom I worked with when I was, it's been 17 years since I worked there, but some of whom I worked with when I was there, this is not a group of people who would sit still for that. And I have a lot of confidence in them, in whatever direction the publisher and the editorial page editor may go.
Yeah, I hope it doesn't come to that. It was Axios today, I think, had a blurb about, they had a map of the U.S. by county and pointing out the fact that most U.S. counties have little to no local news sources, that local journalistic papers are shutting down at a far greater rate than anything is popping up to replace them, even local digital replacements. And so what's interesting is they plot by sort of color across the U.S. By county, again, like where you have multiple sites to go for local news, and the deserts, the huge number of counties out there that have no local media anymore. And I just worry that between the shuttering of, local news, which is a huge part of what, kind of the truth information based democracy that we've enjoyed for hundreds of years is going away, and the narrowing and conglomerating of larger news organizations, many of which are owned by, think of the Sinclair Broadcasting, episode where, all their anchors had to read this, pre-written, pro-Trump statement, whenever that was 3 or 4 years ago. I have deep worries about where the news business is going broadly, but I don't think we've thought through what that means for the balkanization of our politics, where that goes in terms of, everything that Thomas Rid writes about, the epistemic basis of the democratic governance, and if we lose news and agreed upon news, how that further hits and impacts what we're doing. And disinformation, my CI hat, disinformation plays a huge role within that, in being able to make mischief within that environment. And whether you're Russia or China or Steve Bannon or whoever else. There's a lot of opportunity to further undermine what we're doing.
All right. So we've actually gone 15 minutes without my asking you the key question that the news of the last week would beg for a conversation with Pete Strzok about. And that is multiple phone calls between former President Trump and Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. What do you make of it?
Nothing
What?
good. I mean, what he said, it could have been, it was reported, this is in Woodward's most recent book. And Bob Woodward,
The Kremlin confirmed it, by the way.
Yeah, of course they did, because when Trump was denying it and, proving yet again that it was, as reported in Woodward's book, that there were two pieces, right? One was that they had talked at least potentially as many as at least 7 times between, I think, 2021, mid 2021 and now, which is an average of twice a year, maybe. Who knows if it was like 6 times in 1 year and 1 time in 2022, but regularly, and nobody knows what's been said. The Russians know, guarantee there's a recording and a transcript sitting in Putin's office and shared with, trusted members of his administration. And then the other thing that went on, which kind of speaks to the entire nature of the relationship, that Trump sent COVID testing equipment to Putin at a time when the U.S. was struggling, and this wasn't
that was
like
when he was when he was in office,
when he was in president, right? But so I'll tie these together, and why I'm explaining that you're right. So these were conversations. The conversations were post presidency, and then he sent it during the height of COVID when he was in office. But again, these weren't the little like what you and I used, where we swab our nose and you swirl it around and drop 5 drops in the little thing and wait 15 minutes. These were the like hospital grade rapid PCR tests that if you're trying to triage patients in an emergency room, trying to figure out who has COVID, who doesn't, who you have to isolate, we didn't have anywhere near enough. I mean, hospitals were putting, bodies in bags and makeshift refrigerators because the morgues were too full. But nevertheless, Trump made sure Putin had it. And one of the things that in that conversation, Putin said, hey, look, you shouldn't mention this. And Trump's like, well, I don't really care. Again, all this according to Woodward. And Putin's like, no. If you mention this, if it gets out, people are going to be really upset with you. And that's kind of, and Trump said, apparently, okay, fine, I won't mention it. And, Putin, played Trump yet again. I think Putin also would have stood to be extraordinarily embarrassed and had, some threats had it been known that he was having that, because Russia was suffering similar massive casualties from COVID. But the point being that Trump was persuaded by Putin not to say something, and the inherent leverage that then gives Putin, because at any given time, they both know that there's something that could be embarrassing that they both know and hasn't been released. And much like, when we're talking, did Putin say, hey, look, it's probably better to keep this on the down low? And it's never mentioned. And then when it comes out in Woodward's book, and initially Trump denies it, and the Kremlin press cover, whoever it was, turns around and says, yeah, we had these conversations. It's a flex, right? It's like, hey, look, dummy, we, make sure you continue to toe the line, because we were party of this too, and we haven't given it up, and we can at any time. And therefore, do whatever we want, which we don't have to tell you, right? Question NATO, question our treaty obligations. But it's worrisome, right? I mean, what is he? This is the same time where Russia invaded Ukraine, right? Was massively, in a series of escalating U.S. support and questions about how U.S. force could and could not be applied, whether it would be limited to Ukrainian territory or not, trying to put together an alliance, trying to stand up to, rally the Germans, rally other Europeans to provide support to Ukraine and stand up against Russia. At this time, Trump is having multiple conversations with Putin that nobody knows about.
And should we assume, you said the Russians have a recording of this, should we assume that NSA has a recording of it, not because they were targeting Trump, but because foreign head of state communications, it will have been on a non-secure line, because Trump's no longer in office. He doesn't have secure comms. So Putin, whatever he uses to call golf clubs in the United States, is presumably targetable. Should we assume that there's a a redacted conversation where it's minimized to, like Putin calls a U.S. person at his golf club, redacted, U.S. entity, U.S. Um, and they have the following conversation.
I hope so. I hope so. I don't know. I mean, there's always the possibility that, Putin is using a burner phone that the U.S. intel community is not aware of, and they can't target that. I mean, they couldn't target Trump, right? Unless there's something extraordinary that we don't know about where they've got eyes on Trump. But if we know the facilities that Putin is using, presumably that would be something we're trying to collect on. And again, all this goes like, that's the other question. Like what is Trump using to talk to Putin? Is it his iPhone? Is he borrowing Walt Nauda's iPhone? Is he using Alina Habba's iPhone? Is it something where Vlad's like, hey, look, I've got this really funny, slide deck that I'm sending you. Just open this PDF before our call.
Click this.
Just click this. Click this to join our conference call, Don. And Don does it, and then therefore, unloads the FSB Trojan that takes control of that phone and gives the Russians free and full access to that phone to turn on the microphone, to turn on the camera, to dump all the, watch all the, put a keylogger on there and see everything Trump is typing and messaging people on iMessage and Signal and Gab or whatever the fuck you. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't. Do people swear on your show?
Fuck yes.
It's a family show. Good. But there's that whole other, if you start unpacking it from a CI side, it's not just the content of the communication, right? It's not just assurances or demands or agreements that are being made between the two men. It's that Trump and his, ostensible prior cyber czar, Rudy Giuliani, giving you the idea of the level of expertise that these, technically these people have. Trump's like, oh, his computer, it's complicated. It's like the nuclear, the computer is complicated. I have no expectation that Trump has taken any measures to protect the devices that he's using, and there might be more than one that he's using to talk to Putin. And I would absolutely expect, because I would try and do it, I would try and leverage that to exploit every last bit that I could. So does that mean that Trump's iPhone, or again, Alina Habba's, or whoever, the Boris Epstein, whoever the fuck he is using to talk, are those things now themselves technically compromised? Has anybody, because he doesn't trust anybody, he barely gave an interview to the FBI after the assassination attempt. And the Secret Service does physical, I used to say does physical protection really, really well. I might downgrade that to well now, but what they don't do, in my experience, is a really thorough sort of counterintelligence focused protection effort. I could take, the times I went to the White House, to the Situation Room, to the West Wing, there's no way in hell I would ever get a gun, a knife, or anything dangerous in there. But I could bring in 17 bugs and different types of electronic monitoring equipment because they just don't care about that. They care that nobody's going to get hurt. And I could be slapping stick-on IMSI grabber, whatever. It would not be hard to do as a, notionally trusted government employee. So the point being, has anybody gone to Trump and said, hey, look, of these conversations, and we don't really care, you have to say it to them, but by the way, whose phones did you use and where are they now? I doubt it. Is that a good thing? No. Not at all.
Although I think it may be the least of our problems.
And there was, and there are all these little. It came out, and I think it was in Jack Smith's filing, one of the few things that maybe wasn't redacted recently in Chutkan in the DC case, and it was, I think, some of the material they got from the January 6th committee. There was, I think it was a congressman who talked about he was going to get a call, and somebody told him, "Hey, look, it may come from a weird number," and it, in fact, when the call came, the caller ID popped up with an Egyptian number. And the guy's like, huh? And it was Trump. So it's like, what phone is Trump using that the caller ID is showing up as an Egyptian call? I mean, is this just some weird, VoIP service that somebody in Mar-a-Lago decided they could get a great deal through an Egyptian intermediary? I don't, but there are all these things when you look at it and you're like, well, Egypt is weird to begin with. Egypt is especially weird if you look at Carol Lenig's, without confirming whether this is true or false. At least Carol Lenig is reporting that not only did, Trump was there an offer of $10 million from the government of Egypt to the Trump campaign in 2016, but that the U.S. government actually found a withdrawal of $10,000 in U.S. dollars from a Egyptian bank known to be a front for the Egyptian intel service. There are all these, which nobody, by the way, has asked Trump about because their media sucks. like nobody on OAN or Fox is going to ask it, but you would think maybe Jake Tapper or Dana Bash might in the debate ask about whether or not the campaign got $10 million from Egypt, but nobody's asked that. Everybody's forgotten about that. But they're weird. Again, as a counterintelligence guy, all these things just make me super nervous. And not that he has access to classified now, but he still has a ton of stuff in his head. And more importantly, he might be 3 months away from
I'm
being
much more
being back in the
concerned
Oval
about
Office.
the prospective problem than I am about the stuff that's in his head. Though that's serious, it is of declining value every day, whereas the stuff that is he's going to be able to do and he's going to be briefed on 3 months from now is of ascending value every day. And so, without diminishing the importance of the first category, I'm much more worried about the second category. Is that wrong of me?
No, I think that's right. But I mean, of course, it's much more worrisome about when you start looking at everything from our intel and DoD capabilities. And he's a man-child, right? So he loves to sit there in the semi and pretend to blow the horn, just like he allegedly, reportedly was meeting after the presidency with a Australian businessman and reportedly told him about
submarines,
how close submarines could get to enemy submarines without being detected. And it's, again, not it isn't the kind of thing where he's looked at a chart and read in depth and gone through the comparative evolution of U.S. submarine technology between different iterations of Trident subs on our attack submarines and the curve of how much closer we can. I mean, he just saw a graph somewhere that somebody gave him a picture and he was like, gee whiz, neato. And it was one of the random things that stuck in his head because, again, he's a child in many ways. But those are the sort of things that, again, if you're trying to tailor intelligence for him and know, much like in the first administration, he's not going to read a PDB. He maybe will look at a picture. He really likes dioramas. The goal is like how, if you're the DNI or you're his briefer, you're trying to get him to, there's this multi-billion-dollar apparatus that is the U.S. intelligence community that exists to protect U.S. national security and advance the president's role in providing for that national security. And if you're trying to get him to appreciate that and use it and leverage it, you're going to try and find a way to appeal to him. So you're going to get those gee whiz dioramas or photos, the things that he's actually going to pay attention to and therefore remember and talk about on his phone or text somebody or whatever the fuck he's going to do. But yeah, I think that's where I do now though. So here's, let's go through a hypothetical now. He uses a phone. Maybe he uses his own. Maybe he uses Nada's. Maybe he uses Alina Habba's, and the Russians compromise it. And so now they're able to capture everything that's being sent to him in terms of emails, in terms of text, in terms of signal messages, documents, or
sent to Alina Habba or
Alina Habba,
Walt
right?
Nada,
and so as part of that, they're sitting there and saying, okay, well, what is our internal strategy about our filing with the 11th Circuit about the Mar-a-Lago case? How are we going to respond to Chutkan? What are the vulnerabilities here? What hasn't the government? What maybe doesn't the government know about because we didn't see it in the filing? All these sort of internal conversations that a client would have with his attorney. If the Russians have that, I mean, think of the coercive power of that. If you know that somebody's like, wow, they haven't even charged, Fred Johnson, who was a key part of the conspiracy with Walt Nada and De Oliveira, and they don't know about Fred Johnson. And okay, now the Russians know about Fred Johnson. And in one of the 8th phone call between Putin and Trump, he can allude to that. But it any time that you have, like, if I were working for evil, if you get up on somebody's phone and somebody's communications and you're taking a very invasive look at what they're doing, you inevitably come across things that could be used to coerce them. Many of those things are not, from an FBI perspective, it's not relevant. It's not evidence of crime. It's not related to intelligence or counterintelligence or foreign intelligence activity, so it all gets minimized. But if I was trying to, what you do here and gets minimized are, things about somebody had, maybe they've got an STD or they're getting counseling because they're going through a rough spot in their marriage or they've done something wrong. I mean, it's life. You get access to somebody's life and all the things that they're not proud of, they're embarrassed by, they're shamed by, they could be, they don't want known. And if you're on the good guy's side, that gets, minimized, and it's never part of the file, and nobody ever talks about it. If you're the bad guy and you're Russian intelligence listening to Trump's or Alina Habba's or whatnot's
all of that
conversation,
is leverage.
all of that's leverage. And who the fuck cares? Nobody cares. Nobody cares. Oh, Bob Woodward, buys, and and you may love Bob Woodward, but I'm tired of this man who has now shown it. I know he's a young, struggling journalist, and he needs to make a lot of money to make sure he makes it in this world, and so he needs to wait to publish the story once he can get it in the book rather than breaking the news when he learns about it. But I'm obviously being facetious, but I wish this is newsworthy, and I wish it was not pushed out several weeks before the election where everybody's getting overload from October surprises. If it could be reported at the time he learned it in the summertime, and people might think about this a little more like we're thinking about it and ask some of those questions. On the one hand, a voter might be curious about it, but on the other hand, like a counterintelligence part, like somebody in the intel community might care about that and might want to go and try and track down all those phones and make sure that the Russians aren't collecting Kash Patel, Alina Habba, Waltnut, whoever the hell it was. All right.
And is your impression that anything like that is likely to have happened? So Bob Woodward goes public with this. What happens at FBI?
I think the counterintelligence components within the U.S. intelligence community, if they are thoughtful, think about that and say, crap, this could be a real problem. I don't know, given the way that, in what I know best, the FBI, given the FBI's relationship to anything having to do with Trump, that there's a great deal of eagerness to think about, let alone approach Trump about any potential counterintelligence problem. I think people have been scared into just avoiding it. And so to the extent there are a lot of people, hundreds of people like me who would have the same, if you told them that fact pattern, maybe not everybody, but certainly the bright ones would say, oh shit, this is maybe a real problem. But the disincentives that are in place to mention something about Trump from a counterintelligence perspective, the way that Chris Wray, in my opinion, has chosen to staff senior membership of counterintelligence leadership with, let's get fresh blood in there. Let's get on, somebody works CT, that's national security. Somebody work public corruption, that's close. Let's put them in there, right? You don't, people traditionally who would have the expertise to think about issues like this and think through them, I don't know that they exist in the same numbers that they used to. And I worry about the bench when it comes to the senior leadership on the counterintelligence side. They're very good people. There's some that I know who are in there now and are excellent. And I'm certainly, hopefully, having these conversations. But sadly, I would not be surprised if this concern had never made it to the senior leadership. By that, I mean the director and the deputy director. And for the FBI, who's the lead agency for counterintelligence in the United States, if you haven't had that conversation, shame on you.
All right. Let's turn to the election. Since all of this is a much bigger problem if Trump is about to be president than if he's not. How are you feeling?
I'm telling you, I'm realizing that I'm still carrying on a lot of trauma from 2016. I am every time I want to be hopeful that at the end of the day, Americans, whoever they are, following the political spectrum, or tend to be decent people. I don't know. I think back to the 16 where it's like, landslide for Hillary. To all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's the same chances of making a 55-yard field goal. And all of a sudden I'm trying to get myself ready for a long fight. And I am discouraged by the fact that Trump is a symptom, right? I mean, he's encouraging things, but at the end of the day, there are tens of millions of Americans who spent 4 years under his presidency and have said, yeah, give me some more of that. And I can't wrap my head around that. And I, like everybody else, have read some compelling sort of thought pieces on what motivates people, how people, how denial works, how if you affiliate with a candidate and you double down, and all the various, what grievances might be there, the cost of admitting that you're wrong and what that does to, a blow to your ego and your self-identification, and on and on and on. But at the end of the day, the guy is absolutely a fascist, is a sexual abuser, is a misogynist, is a racist, is antithetical to anything our founding fathers would want in the presidency. And the fact that it could be this close on October the 24th, I'm discouraged. And I'm in it for the long haul. I spent 20 years putting on a gun and running towards the fight, and the past 8 years fighting against it. But at some point, man, it gets tiresome and tiring, and it's there's no time to be tired.
Right. Rest when you're dead. So what will you spend the next 4 years doing if worse comes to worse? What does the fight look like for you?
I don't know.
I don't. You get the top bunk at our shared cell.
Right. Guantanamo, I will be, all the tricks of, prison cooking that I've learned from talking to various people we convicted across the years. I'll tell you to make I don't know. And it's funny because I've had everything from conversations with people you might imagine and senior people you might not imagine about what does a responsible response look like if Trump is, from everything like, you can leave the country, or do you need to leave the country, or do you need to move, or what sort of precautions do you need to take? Or there's, folks who are going out there and, buying property, or, do you need citizenship? And and how deeply do you go to start not only researching, but do you reach out to people within foreign governments to say, if I need to do it, could I I'm looking just for, temporary residency for, a few months, and maybe extend that out. I'm not looking to become a permanent resident, but do you, is it a responsible thing to reach out to allied government personnel and have those conversations or not? Or just like, is it enough to do research and then make up your mind after the election is called? If you have to, then you've got 2 months with everybody else who's trying to get the hell out. And some of it, everybody's position is different. I think, unfortunately, I think there are a lot of people who think, are worried about it and maybe don't have the same personal exposure that, there's a core set of people, because Trump has a cast of characters in his head.
I don't
Jim
know how
Comey is probably at or near the top of the list, but
I don't know how high up the list you are, but you're pretty high.
If in a sane world, I would not be high at all. But given Trump's, he's like a child who is stuck. He still complains about Barack Hussein Obama,
right,
and Hillary Clinton. He has again, it's a sign of his, in my opinion, advanced age and dwindling mental capacity, that his fight snapshot in time. I mean, he may think about, the current, the Biden crime family or whatever, but his narrative, I fear, is still focused on the grievances of 2015 and 2016. And then, of course, the other problem is, again, all these people, it's like the people who, moved when he was giving a speech at some naval base, and the USS John McCain was in view of the podium where he was speaking. And some officer said, you have to move it. And they ended up moving the boat, not because anything Trump did, but because they anticipated that's what he would want. I worry it's not, you look at any authoritarian, they don't have the list. It's their little, the head of their Secret Service, the head of their, the enforcers who have the big list. That's not given from the top. But when you do that, it's like, how expansive is it? And then the other thing is like, I don't think, frankly, the FBI or DHS has enough personnel to do, they could investigate 50, 60 people, but they can't do thousands. There are not enough people who would agree to do that. And so then the question is, okay, and the same thing is like, if he wins, will I go traveling to Arkansas, Texas? No. But do I feel fairly safe in Northern Virginia or DC? Yeah. But the question is, does Trump say, well, we've got these people who are, loosely affiliated militia groups, and we're just going to encourage them and, turn a blind eye. So if they're out there engaging in violence or threats of violence, we just won't investigate that. And local law enforcement would get overwhelmed. You got some vigilante group who comes in, and they're, they have their list, and they're going from state to state to state. Local law enforcement doesn't have the resources to investigate that, and the Kash Patel in charge of the FBI says, well, we're not going to investigate that. It might be a federal crime, but we have other priorities down at the border. And so you have a enabling of extra governmental
Right.
actors.
Conveying impunity. And this is why the January 6th pardons are so important, because it conveys impunity from the beginning. And so, if you commit crimes in support of me, you'll be taken care of. And you never have to say that in order to say it. You just have to show it. People actually understand that message, and you can do a lot without the government ever doing anything. So,
Right.
what are your favorite overseas destinations these
Oh
days?
man, sounding like I've like past year, and again, not specifically asylum shopping, but went to Portugal and Spain on 2 different trips. Loved them both. Hit Ireland, which was amazing and also super affordable. I mean, and then the question is like, okay, well, then what are you doing with your life to in the meantime? I mean, I've got a podcast which I can keep doing from overseas, but and then the question is, well, what do you do with your family, right? Do you take them to or not? Canada's closer by, but everybody's it'll be like, I there I would hope a number of good options, and I would hope
I'm telling you, the closest, nicest destination that's easy with political asylum, Iceland. At least in the summer.
yeah, well, Iceland had a rich, like when we were investigating, well, yes, Iceland has a
We couldn't get them to give up Bobby Fischer
I
at some point.
I stopped myself. So yeah, I agree. I agree. Iceland is, yeah, but
And there are thermal baths where you can have a beer and record your podcast from a thermal bath. By the way, people who you've been doing that podcast since the last time you've been on in lieu of fun. So tell us about your podcast.
Yeah, no, so definitely. So it's called Clean Up on Aisle 45. I do it with Allison Gill, who is also known as Mueller. She wrote from the podcast, or from the Twitter account and podcast she had during the Mueller investigation. But essentially, we track all the ongoing crimes and accountability conducted by Trump and those around him. So everything from the state trials in New York and Georgia, which people know about, but also all the elector trials, which are going on, investigations in Wisconsin and Michigan and Arizona and Colorado, all the attorneys who are facing disbarment proceedings, some successfully like Rudy, some like Sidney Powell, who somehow fucking Texas dropped the ball and she's still licensed in the bar, but looking at what accountability looks like. And the shocking thing is how long, I mean, everybody's aware how long, you think about Trump and you're like, oh my God, Mar-a-Lago, we're waiting for remand from 11th Circuit, or waiting for Chutkan if he doesn't get elected. But all these other things take forever too. It just, the path of justice is slow. And so anyway, the podcast, again, Clean Up on Aisle 45, we just talk about and track all of these different things. Things like Mark Meadows and Jeff Clark recently got smacked down because they went up to the 11th Circuit appealing, saying that those state accusation, and this because you cover it super well along with Anna and all kinds of people at Lawfare, had said that it should be removed to federal court out of the Georgia state court system because they were federal officers, and both got Meadows and Clark, I think, this week smacked down from the 11th Circuit in the past couple of weeks. So all those ins and outs with, and it's free, so check it out where you get your podcasts, and if you like it, become a subscriber and you get bonus episodes every week where we swear a lot and vent.
Yeah, so it wasn't one of her podcasts for a while. The slogan was "The News with Cursing." Is that this one? Or
yeah, she says, and that morphed. I'm trying to remember, and it's interesting because Allison is like one super hard worker, but she took Mueller, She Wrote, and turned it into Mueller, She Wrote Media, and so she hosts. Mueller, She Wrote became the Daily Beans, which is like a daily podcast where she puts out news with cursing. She does Clean Up on Aisle 45 with me. She does the Jack podcast with Andy McCabe, looking specifically at Jack Smith stuff. And then she's got other podcasts that she's not involved with that are on the platform. But, unlike Tim Pool and Tenet Media, who are getting paid, $100,000 of Russian money every episode, she's like turned that one sort of 100 subscriber podcast during the Mueller special counsel time into a pretty robust organization. So
yeah, so Tim Pool, good name drop there. So let's return to counterintelligence issues for a minute and talk about Tenet Media, which seemed to me to be a significantly undercovered story.
mhm.
But seemed, I guess, what I took from it was that the uh, military intelligence or SVR folks had decided that there was no reason to create bot farms to create influencers like 10GOP, like the ones that you guys discovered. You could just buy existing influencers and it's faster. Um, how do you read that case? Like, is it just that they figured out that these people are actually infinitely corruptible, so you don't have to build audience? Or is it something else?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great observation on your point. I think largely there is from a very high level, a strategic evolution of the way Russians have and are doing disinformation from 2016, and exactly what you said, that back in 15, 16, they were creating personas. They were sending people here to do research. They were reaching out through these personas and engaging in some cases directly with people on the ground in the U.S. and getting different sides to try and show up at the same protest on opposite sides. But both because that's hard to do effectively, and the U.S. started wising up to it, figured out that there were plenty of people out there who had essentially the narratives they wanted to advance that already had those perspectives and followers, and that they could support and amplify and cause to, just expand their listenership. And some of it you got to and so Tim Pool and Benny Johnson, I mean, we're talking millions of subscribers, whether it's on social media or YouTube. But the notion that everybody says, oh, and so the Russians smartly, and what makes it particularly hard from a law enforcement perspective is, it's one thing if you're a directed winning agent, and I know I'm talking to the Russians and the Russians are paying me to advance the narrative, but if I've got a cutout, however tenuous, however slender of a fig leaf it is, that I think I'm getting money from a Canadian entity that wants me to keep doing what I'm doing, that's really hard to prove. And in fact, none of these folks were charged, right? I mean, they charged some Russians in the DOJ indictment. It's interesting. There are a couple of Canadians that clearly, I think, hit foreign agent violations that weren't charged. And so there's a lot of speculation. Is there sealed complaint? Would they've been charged, flipped, and they're cooperating? Is it coming? But none of these entities, the kind of invoices, were. But what is interesting is the way, and the Russians have been doing this since the revolution, right? I mean, look at the trust, right? And again, I talked about Dzerzhinsky at the beginning of the episode, but they have been setting up disinformation channels targeting political opposition from the founding of the state in 17. So this is just a sort of core component of who they are and how they operate in the intel space, and it's just evolved in the information age. It is interesting, though, that one, these folks thought that they merited. I mean, people are upset that, oh, Tim Pool, because he shut down his podcast, he's not getting his $100,000 anymore. It's not. It wasn't $100. It was $100,000 a week.
Right.
$100,000. So it wasn't $100,000. It was $5.2 million, right? 52 weeks in a year for a 1 hour show once a week. This was not $100,000. This was 5.2.
So,
and that's
but hang on a second. I want to back up here, because one of the interesting things was how little traffic one of them was getting $400,000 per video, and the videos weren't even getting any traction. So assuming the Tenet Media people are not morons, but that this is actually doing something, it seems to me they're buying something other than the traffic they can generate. And I did my sort of thinking like Pete, thinking about this. It seems to me what they're buying is, if they get you, Pete Strzok, to make a video that says, Vlad is our leader, we will not be moved. Volodya is our leader, we will not be moved, just like a tree that's standing by. All right, you make that video. Then you come on Dog Shirt TV and I say, who's your leader? And it's a little bit psychologically difficult for you to say, oh, I don't know, I hate that Putin guy, right? Because you're sort of on the record somewhere else with the Volodya is our leader song, right? And so you've got, and so what they're actually buying is your commitment to certain, you're being on the record on certain things in fashions that are then hard to contradict elsewhere.
Yeah, and they did guide some of it, right? I mean, there was one, again, this is in the indictment of the two Russians, where they talk about after the Crocus Mall attack outside of Moscow, that they said, hey, well, somebody interested in covering this, because it was ISIS linked individuals, I think, as best we know, who conducted that attack on the shopping mall outside of Moscow.
Tajiks
but then there was
associated with ISIS-K.
Right, there's a request that came in and said, hey, can one of your people talk about the possibility that it was Ukraine behind this? And somebody jumped in and said, sure, I'll cover that. And so they spent, and I forget who it was of the four, picked that up. And they spent an episode where, at least in part of it, they talked about the possibility that it was, in fact, Ukraine who was behind this attack on the mall.
But what value is a very expensive, a very expensive video that gets no traction?
Yeah, but it does, right? But it does. I mean, it does seep in there. I mean, it's the same thing when Tulsi Gabbard would go on Tucker's show and talk about the biolabs in Ukraine. I mean, Tulsi doesn't, she's not a biologist. She's not, who is driving this conversation? But all these things take root in the public consciousness. And at the end of the day, when you get to the big issue of like, well, should we be supporting Ukraine or not? It's like, well, God, but yeah, the rumors they were like running around killing people in Russia, and they're doing some shady shit that, that the US was like with Fauci doing I mean, it takes root in the subconscious of Ukraine bad. And again, you and I look at that and say, oh my God, $5.2 million a year. Like one Sukhoi, one MiG that Russia is using right now in the war, in attacking and launching missiles targeting civilians in Ukraine. One of those fighter bombers costs upwards of $50-60 million. So one aircraft in Ukraine, you could do 10 things the size of $5.2 million, right? So you say, on the one hand, you say that's a lot of money for a podcast, but on the other hand, it's one fighter bomber gets you 10 things like this. And so when you get somebody like Matt Taibbi, who's got a Substack, and Elon gets him to publish the Twitter files, and suddenly he has a surge in Substack providers. Well, who are those people? Who's providing this money for this person who is very distrustful of the U.S. government, who sees a deep state conspiracy at every turn? If you can fund somebody, it doesn't take a lot. I mean, for you and me, I mean, I'd be overjoyed if I got a tenth of that cost-wise
Russia,
for a podcast.
If you're listening.
Yeah.
That was
I hope
joke,
you're listening to Dog Shirt TV, because if for the low cost of a steady stream of new dog shirts every week,
$5.2 million, I promise to never convey a single bullet point. But I will happily take your money. And I promise I'll do just as many, projections on the Russian embassy, but I'll say these projections are brought to you by Tenet Media.
Yeah, and one last thought on that, right? I mean, you think about intelligence operations. I mean, it's one thing if you're recruiting somebody because you say, look, I need to know the most classified information about this radar absorbent material that you're putting on the latest version of the stealth jet. There are only a handful of people who know that. They're going to guard that. That's restricted information. You have to formally recruit somebody and task them to do it in all likelihood, and they know who they're dealing with. If you're just if you're engaging in disinformation operations, you don't need the same level of witting. Who cares if they know? It's better if they don't know. Right. And so it's better if you find, and that was the other thing, one of the other things in the indictment that mentioned Russians are maintaining this list of at least several hundred accounts that they saw as sympathetic to Russian narratives. And people have mistaken that and said, there are lists of hundreds of American Russian agents. No, it didn't say that. It said that the Russians have identified influencers who are advancing narratives that are sympathetic to Russian narratives and national strategic goals. And it would be intelligence malpractice if you're Russia not to say, hey, we've identified 100-200 people who are saying things that are very helpful for what we're trying to achieve strategically. Let's encourage them. And let's do it so discreetly that at a
they don't
minimum, they've
even
got
know it.
plausible deniability at a minimum. And at best, they don't know, because we don't need to. They're already saying what we want said. We don't need
Right.
to tell them what to say, because they're already saying it. We just need to increase their reach. We need to give
Lenin's
them.
famous description of this was useful idiots, and the phrase conveys the contempt that that he had for them. So, speaking of projection operations, there's going to be one Sunday evening in Philadelphia.
Nice. What's in Philly?
Lots of people who haven't voted yet. We're gonna remind people that they need to vote. If you are watching this and you want to join us, let us know, and we will. The estimable Richard Wattenbarger and I will be happy to have you join us. Um, Pete Strzok, make sure that you consume adequate quantities of alcohol over the next 2 weeks. It's
I need to find and reinforce healthy ways of dealing with stress and apprehension.
well,
And maybe if it's good enough for Winston Churchill on the fighting back the Nazis, then that's probably fine, right?
I will just say I have discovered lying on a bed of nails, and I'm not joking. It is the most relaxing, fabulous thing.
I thought you discovered, what's your cult like workout thing that you do with
Oh,
the little
I've
Pilates
been,
machine? Do you still do whatever?
Solid core is good too. It got me through the first Trump administration. But lying on a bed of nails.
Now you move to a bed of nails.
Yeah, the bed of nails is pretty amazing, actually. And you lie on it the first, I would say 3 minutes are excruciating. And then your body relaxes into it. And you spend half an hour on it, and it is deliciously, not quite comfortable, but really feels great. And when you get up the next morning, you feel all loose, and
it's swollen from all the nail injuries on your back.
I was going to say, yeah, you have little holes in your back. No, it's fabulous. So I prescribe you one bed of nails and a lot of scotch, and we will see you on the other side, either from an undisclosed location somewhere in Portugal, or
you and me in the prison yard in Gitmo.
Exactly.
Scrambling for the community microphone with everybody lined up for their podcast.
Exactly. It'll be like
the library at Guantanamo that has 85 podcasts weekly that everybody signs up for your hour.
Who do we like? We're gonna have the cool cell block.
Oh my God, I'm gonna be the fucking king of the yard, Ben.
We get Brennan.
I'm like, yeah, I got yard boss lined up. I'm ready.
But I
don't
want the lawyers. I don't want, like Mark Elias or I think they get their own.
Right.
Right. I don't think we want to share the cells with the lawyers. All right, we're going to leave it there. Folks, we're going to be back. I haven't made a schedule for next week yet. You'll get an email when I do. You are all great Americans, and thank you for bearing with me with the time change for today's show. It ended up colliding with Trump trials and tribulations. Keep the faith. 10 more days. Give money. Call your friends. Tell your friends to fucking do the right thing. And remember, not everybody needs to vote. That whole everybody get out and vote thing. No, all of us need to get out and vote. And if the other side has a little bit of, we're not going to call it voter suppression, but a little bit of demoralization and discouragement. That's okay. See you next time.